Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is our latest online learning question and answer session with Dylan, William, and Chris Harrison. Again, as always, we are very thankful for them giving up their time when they're such busy people. We thank you very much for your questions that you've submitted to the course. Our questions today are looking at differentiation for learning. And without further ado, if you get your pens and papers ready to make any notes of ideas that you pick up, we will begin with your questions. As always, the question and answer will go up online afterwards, and we suggest that you go and look at people's comments to deepen your learning too from what they're discussing. So we will start by looking at questions that we've linked to pupil motivation. The first question to Dylan then is from Afshan. Afshan's asking a long question here, which kind of like I've summarised as the key bit being that if a student who has no known diagnosis of some sort of special needs is given easier work each time, then how are they going to feel challenged to work harder? Are we not lowering the expectations for them? Your thoughts, Dylan?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we have to get the challenge just right. So Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, in his work on flow, suggested that when you get work that's too easy, you get apathy and boredom. And when the work is too hard, you get disengagement and rejection. So the challenge is to make the work hard enough to allow the student to engage meaningfully in it, but not so hard that the child gives up. But I think there's another important point, which is that when we're giving students assessments, what do we mean by those assessments? So if we give a student a test, say halfway through a unit, how can we compare the scores that we get on that assessment with scores at the end of the unit? Because they haven't learned half the material yet, so it doesn't make any sense to grade them. So I think the crucial principle is that our reporting of student achievement to parents and to students should be based on what proportion of the work that they've done so far have they understood. But any final grade for a term or a semester or a year should be the score of the achievement at the end of that learning period. So of course we should give students feedback in terms of scores or grades as they work through the unit, but those scores should not count towards a final grade, because otherwise you're guaranteeing a student who has a slow start fails the unit before they're halfway through. So I mean, those are my personal preferences. The absolutely unavoidable thing is to make sure that you understand what it is your scores and grades are meant to represent. My preference is that they should be the achievement at the end of the unit, but other people might have different views, because obviously counting towards the final grade, something done early in the course, provides a motivating effect. But I think we also have to be serious about some of the recent research from Canada and other places that shows that success causes motivation at least as much as motivation causes success. So I think that giving students challenging work, supporting them to be successful in that work, making sure they're learning it and remembering it, that can be more motivating than just saying you need to do this. So I think it's a very difficult balancing act, but I would be very worried if we were deliberately lowering the standards for low achieving children. As a colleague of mine used to say, you don't raise standards by lowering them.
One of the important things for teachers is to actually take note not just of what their students are doing, but the way that they're actually responding to whatever activities are there. Children want to be challenged to some extent, but they don't actually want to go too far out of their comfort zone. And so pitching activities that for the range of children you've got in your class will mean that all children get included, but that some actually can, if they actually move on and grasp whatever it is you're doing quite quickly, have got other aspects to move on to. So it's actually being really aware of your children, how they've actually performed in previous lessons on similar sorts of activities, and then having something planned to actually move them on. And then in the lesson itself, to note how it's going on, and then to encourage those that have actually achieved what you want them to achieve, to move on to the other things that are there. What is really key is not just having something that's more of the same, so that it's not you've got to do more just because you got there first. It's actually thinking, right, so how you actually can now understand that particular aspect of science. Let's say you now actually understand when you're working in forces that when you actually are moving something, it's either going to change its speed or change its the angle that it's going to move at, etc. Give them a whole range of other things to look at that actually might then enable them to move that idea on, to maybe look at it within an everyday context. So they're not just doing it with lab apparatus, they're applying it to everyday life. Or possibly, say, in biology, where possibly they've been looking at the difference between animal and plant cells, maybe having just a microscope, a couple of microscopes set up at the side, where they can go and look at a whole range of slides where you've actually covered up the name of what this actual slide is, and they've got to identify, is this a slide of animal cells or plant cells? Why do you think that? So it's not a big thing to go on to, but it's something that actually takes the knowledge and the ideas that they've gained and actually allows them to do something more on that then they can possibly bring back and talk to the rest of the class. So while maybe not all the class get to do that last bit, they actually do hear about it. And you as a teacher can flash up those particular slides on the screen so it can be talked to by the students who've worked on it. And that brings others up to about a reasonable-ish level to where the others are. So it's that sort of boxing and coxing that we see teachers doing all the time that really helps to keep all your students motivated and moving forward, and not just thinking either this is too easy, I can relax, or this is too hard, I can't access it. It's actually trying to make sure that they're all moving along at a reasonable rate, but it won't be the same rate. And I think realising that is quite important.
That's lovely. I think Emma and Habiba have questions that kind of link into this. They were asking about, do you have any advice on how to increase the intrinsic motivation of students? I think you've already started answering that one. Is there anything additional you'd like to add?
Well, I think intrinsic motivation is difficult because, in fact, there isn't much consensus about what it means. So just labeling motivation as either intrinsic or extrinsic doesn't actually help very much. And I think Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory provides a more useful perspective. So, for example, some students might work because their parents make them work. Some students might work because they feel bad if they fail. But some students work hard at, say, mathematics because they want to be an engineer. They don't actually particularly like mathematics, but they accept that being good at mathematics is part of the package of being an engineer. And therefore, whether we call that motivation intrinsic or extrinsic doesn't matter so much. The important point is that the student is motivated to do well, even though they might not be intrinsically motivated. They have an extrinsic motivation, but it's a powerful extrinsic motivation. And I think that we too easily fall into extrinsic versus extrinsic. And the challenge for most teachers is you need your students to be successful at things they're not intrinsically motivated to achieve. And so sometimes we need to get students to understand why these things are important. And sometimes they're just positional goods. You need to get these qualifications in order to get onto sixth form studies or to university. And having a much more complete conceptualization of motivation, accepting that sometimes the best we can do is some extrinsic motivation, but let's make sure it's the best kinds of extrinsic motivation where the student signs up to the values and the student is also in charge of the locus of control. I am choosing to do this because I want to be successful.
Thank you, Dylan. That's much appreciated. Did you say that was Deci and Ryan? I'm just making a note of the research references as we're going.
Ryan, and it's called self-determination theory.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. The next question we've got then, we had quite a lot of questions. Obviously, we're looking at a course that's entitled Differentiation for Learning. We had a lot of questions that were grouped around how we support learners with different needs.
I think with special educational needs children, you will know specifically what their needs are. They probably have got some sort of statement where that's written down. You've probably been working with them in previous lessons. So you're well aware of their needs and what you need to do as a teacher in order to help them access into a particular activity. And so with special educational needs, there usually is with differentiation more planning or more sorting out to do before you start the lesson, because getting that access is harder for those children, and therefore planning for that access is key to what you actually do. What I actually see when I go into classrooms is sometimes when you do have, let's say, a TA working with a child where the child's got educational needs, other children tend to join in and actually benefit from that special planning that's done for that one child. So although the focus is on moving that one child forward so they can access, sometimes the ideas to being used for that can help one or two others who maybe on that day are just not actually accessing in that easily. And, you know, it's this sort of idea of realizing what might be useful and then planning for that. And so special educational needs does take more planning and does take more time.
This idea, this using the higher attaining pupils as experts in the class, Cornelia is asking, doesn't that mean that they sacrifice their time for their own learning? Is it unfair to them as learners if we're getting them to be experts for others in the classroom?
One of the most interesting things about the research on peer tutoring is that many studies have found that those who give help benefit as much or even more than those who receive help. We're not entirely sure of mechanisms for this, but every teacher I've ever met says, I never understood this until I had to teach it. And some recent research suggests that one of the ways in which being asked to explain it to others improves your own understanding of these things is because it forces retrieval practice. It forces you to retrieve things from memory, which is known from other research to actually increase long-term memory. But the interesting tweak here is that if a student explains something to somebody else by following pages of a textbook, that's less successful because they're not required to retrieve it for themselves. But if students have to make up explanations, then it's more helpful. And of course, the best way to do this is to actually ask a high achieving student to think of 3 different ways of explaining it. And then they're forced to think about things in a broader way. Their existing ideas are more firmly connected to new ideas and therefore remembered for longer. So you don't need to worry about this. It's very ironic, I know, because whenever I talk to teachers about peer tutoring, they always worry about the parents of the high achieving children complaining that their darling genius will be held back by being made to explain it to the slower children. And that's just not what we find in practice. But the important point is, as the work of Robert Slavin showed, what you've got to avoid if you have group tutoring is that all the students must be involved in either giving or receiving help. So if you have a mixed ability group of 4 students, sometimes it becomes just a conversation between the highest achiever and the lowest achiever in that group. So the important thing is to structure these groups so that all students are either involved in giving or receiving help. That seems to be the key ingredient for making peer tutoring effective.
Thank you, Dylan. That's really helpful. So this idea about retrieval practice and then all pupils having learning responsibility is coming out very strongly there from that answer. So thank you, Cornelia, for that. I think you got some great advice there. We've had a couple of questions about teaching learners who have English as a second language or in modern foreign languages. Do you have any ideas or advice for that, Dylan? So we had quite a few, I think, who've asked things about that. I'm just looking here on the list so I can name people. So I know Elise did, Sarita and Tatiana. So how can we support students who don't speak in the first language that they're in the classroom in? Any ideas at all or advice for us?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to differentiate between English language learners and the teaching of modern foreign languages. Not because they're different, but because the way that we teach them is. So there's no doubt that immersion is a very effective way of learning a foreign language. But in most schools, students get an hour's lesson once every other day in a modern language. That's not immersion. So I think we shouldn't be using models of ELL for teaching modern languages, and we shouldn't use models of modern foreign languages for teaching ELL students. This is very difficult. There is very little research in this area that actually bears on the practice of classroom activities. But one of the things that's crucial is, do you have other speakers of the child's native language who are more fluent in English, and they can actually work with those students? So one of the things that's very effective in mathematics, for example, is where students have some tradition of literacy in their own language, they work on a mathematics problem, for example, in their mother tongue, and then they figure out how to express that in English. So what you're doing is reducing the cognitive load. Rather than making the students work in English, you reduce the cognitive load by actually allowing them to discuss it in French or Spanish, whatever language they happen to speak at home. And then you're encouraging them to think about how might you express that in the language of the classroom. But ultimately, there's no quick fix here. It's a very slow process. There's no magic bullet. Students who are learning language are going to have a great deal of difficulty if the language in the classroom is a language they're not very familiar with. What we don't yet know is what are the optimum balances of taking students out versus leaving them in. And of course, some teachers are much better at supporting those language abilities. So the key thing here, and this is going to come throughout the whole of this session, I think we need to look more at what I call inclusive differentiation rather than a separate differentiation. So often when teachers differentiate, they prepare 3 different mini lessons for the high achievers, the middle students, and the low achievers. And that's just not very smart. A, it's a lot of work for the teacher. Second, of course, you might get the pitch wrong for a particular student. Getting the student to the right lesson is very challenging without doing a massive amount of diagnostic assessment. So I think that kind of separate differentiation is very difficult to do well, generally doesn't work. There's very little evidence that helps it. What I would much rather see is what I call inclusive differentiation. So let me give you an example, which people who've looked at the other courses will be familiar with. A standard topic in Key Stage 3, middle school math in other systems, is the area of a trapezium. So the standard method is the teacher introduces the rule, does one worked example, and the students practice this in their seats. A better model would be to actually introduce one method of finding the area of a trapezium, and then asking students in groups to come up with as many different ways of finding the area of trapezium they can. And what the teacher can then do is go around the class, probing and pushing, and where some students are doing very well, the teacher might say, one of these methods involves areas with similar triangles. By actually completing the triangle and subtracting the area of the smaller triangle off the area of the larger triangle, find the area of the residual trapezium. Now that's a very challenging task, and it involves a lot of algebraic manipulation to get the same standard formula. But the point is, all the students are engaged in the same task, but the teacher is producing differentiation by challenging some students to attempt the task at a high level. And I think those kinds of models of differentiation are what we should be working towards, rather than this idea of planning separate classroom experiences for different students. It's a lot of work for the teacher. You won't get the students to the right activity, and even if you could, there's no evidence that it's very effective.
Thank you, Dylan. That's really powerful.
People don't read enough in science, and one of the things that I'm always encouraging my pre-service teachers to do is to do more reading in the classroom, to allow students to read and access knowledge and use that science knowledge in the classroom. So generally, I'd encourage reading in the classroom. But you're quite right, some children read better than others. What we did when we were doing work on another project very early on at King's, the Cognitive Acceleration Science Education, is we actually made use of groups to actually help, so that children help one another with their reading. So we would think carefully about how we assembled the groups, so that if children were having difficulty, they were reading as a group and looking at things as a group. And that tended to sort of mitigate any problems that were there, so that they could still do the thinking, even if they couldn't initially do the reading. I know we have sometimes in some classrooms that I've seen move to actually having differentiated worksheets, so some are actually easier than others. And I've seen that work, but it's not so much the science, because you still need to use the science terminology or the maths terminology that's there. It's actually the other language that goes with it that the children need to be made simpler, because sometimes when we're expressing things, we don't do that easily. I saw it in a lesson only the other day, where a teacher was actually talking about sound, and they were talking about how sound moves through solids, liquids, and gases. And the teacher then said, so it depends on the medium. And I saw a couple of children look around and think, so what do they mean it depends on the medium? They didn't understand that medium meant the material it was moving through. They thought of medium meaning small, large, and medium. They thought it was to do with size, and they didn't cotton on at all. Now, you could see with a child who maybe was having reading problems, that maybe that sort of language thing could come through as well. If they read something in a book like that, then not only might they have trouble actually reading some of the words, they actually have trouble interpreting some of the meaning from it, because some of the science meaning we have is quite difficult. So I think one of the important things to do is to actually start looking for particular pieces of reading, and if there are difficulties in them, either change the reading Obviously, it's in a book, you can't do that. But if it is on one of your materials that you've actually produced, you can change that. So look and see where the problems are coming with the reading within any of your resources. Or if it's a book, look ahead and say, pick that one out and say, well, when we mean medium, what do we mean here? Or when we mean this, what do we mean here? And it could be everyday language. It could be particular terms that are used in different ways in science. Or it could just simply be some of the sentences are rather long and they need to be cut up into smaller sentences to actually help some of those children access in. So sometimes it's actually altering the materials, but more likely what you would be doing to try and get the reading sorted out is to actually use other children as a resource to help, so that the reading doesn't become the problem. The problems they're sorting out becomes the science and mathematics that they're doing.
Moving on then, our next question comes from several people again. So this is Siobhan, Emma, Rajalakshmi have all asked, how can they manage it without just handling out more advanced questions for those who are finding work too easy, to actually support students who have got SEN needs, special educational needs, in their classrooms?
Okay, so I think if you've got SEN involved, it's particularly tailoring the support work for them, and it might be working with another student or a group of students, or it might be that if you've got a teaching assistant that they would work with them, or it might be that you would free yourself as a teacher to work with them. So it's actually deciding what really would be best for that student and individualising it for them. I think the other way of doing it is to provide them with something that allows them to see the type of work the others are doing, but they can actually access. So the way they document their work might be by recording it or drawing it, rather than having to write it if writing is a problem for them. It's a matter really of deciding what the needs are of the child and then responding to that and planning for that in advance.
Some ideas there about how we can support all of our learners. The next question, Dylan, I'm going to ask to you first. This is posted by Ross and Venus. Question asking, do we need to differentiate for learning at college tertiary level? And if so, do you have ideas for how we could do this?
To borrow a definition from Hall, Strangman and Meyer, differentiation is needed whenever you have students of differing abilities within the same group. And you have students of different abilities when you have more than 2 students in the same group, or even sometimes when you have 2 students in the same group. So, I mean, differentiation is always appropriate. The question is how you're going to do it. And the fact is that all our students come in with different needs, different abilities, different experiences, and yet we have to do something to get them to participate productively in the sessions that we run. So some kind of starting point is to find out where students are, and then you have to make judgments. So for example, you might do a screening assessment at the beginning of a lecture and find out that half the students don't understand the fundamental principles of the thing you're teaching, but you thought they did, in which case it might be appropriate to go back and teach that stuff again. You might see that all the students get it apart from 1 or 2, in which case the kinds of things that Chris just mentioned, finding time to sit down with that student individually and help them might be more appropriate. But the really crucial thing is that it's always going to be a professional judgment about how to make sure that the time we are spending with our students is used as productively as possible for the maximum number of students. And the other thing you have to take into account is how important is this? So, you know, we'd like to think that everything we teach is important, but some of it is much more important than others. So, you know, is this something that the student needs to understand? Could it wait a few months for the student to get this? Should I leave it alone for a little while? Those are professional judgments that you're going to have to take on the fly in every single teaching situation. But the starting point is always good evidence about where the students are. And you'd expect me to say this, the starting point for all good differentiation is formative assessment. Find out what your students know already and then make adjustments accordingly. And that's why it's so difficult. And, you know, we generally find more variation in achievement than we would like, and therefore we have to make compromises. So I think the really important idea is there's never going to be a perfect way of doing this, and you're always going to make compromises. There are going to be trade-offs. You're going to involve some students not getting as much challenging work as they would like, or you're going to get some students getting work that's too hard. But those are the imperfections of any mass education system. Anything other than private tuition is going to lead to those trade-offs.
Lovely, Dan. Thank you very much. Lots of really useful ideas. Chris, anything to add to that one?
So I think what Dylan said is correct in that you can't support every student all of the time. And I think it's important to realise that as long as you take note of that over, say, several lessons or several sessions, then you can support the students so that they can actually keep going. And sometimes that way of sort of giving them time to work things out as well as to be there supporting them allows them to build better working habits, particularly if we're talking about older students.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that. Thanks, Dylan. And thank you for your questions there. Moving on, the next question that I have got here comes under a heading that I've put as planning, curriculum coverage and assessment. Jacqueline, Shalini, Sarita, Mary, Cornelia, Liz and Elsa in with this first question. And I know that it's come up on the threads on the course. How can I use, and you've already mentioned it, I think, how can I use differentiation in all my lessons, keeping the workload planning manageable, especially if we've got large classes of students? So I'm going to go first to Chris for this one. Chris, ideas about managing our workload?
I think differentiation can be a problem. And it's going back to what I said earlier. Differentiation is not doing one-to-one tuition to all 30 children in your class. What differentiation is doing good diagnostic assessment as you're going through, whether that's questions that you ask or just observation of how children are doing their work, and then making decisions for the lessons coming up of what you need to do to keep things flowing so that children are actually challenged by the work that's coming up. And by challenge, I mean challenged by the science ideas, not challenged by accessing in. So it's planning for those children who maybe are struggling a bit with that topic. Maybe, you know, a particular topic is not familiar to them, either because they've not done a lot of it before in their previous schooling, or maybe just their everyday lives have actually not allowed them to come across some of those ideas. I mean, if you take the topics like, say, conservation and ecosystems and so on, you know, some children are really interested in that and they've actually researched a lot on the internet and know an awful lot. Other children don't know some of the words on there or haven't really got an idea what global warming is, or, you know, is it the same or is it different to, let's say, something like pollution? Is pollution and global warming the same thing? And so it's actually trying to grasp where they're at in their learning. The whole thing we have behind assessment learning, where are they at in their learning? What are the problems that's actually stopping them moving forward? What can I do for those particular kids or that group of kids in order to actually help them move forward with it? And so it's responsive teaching. So only respond when you need to. Don't plan for all the kids doing something different. Plan for maybe one or two things that you might do in that next lesson to either support this group or those 3 children, or maybe just to work generally on, you know, on a particular aspect, like you found that a lot of them are having difficulties doing scales on the graph. So maybe your starter might be doing something where everybody just does a quick scaling on the graph, and you can then ascertain whether the kids you think have got it really have got it so they can move on, and the 1 or 2 who haven't, you know that in the lesson you're going to either have to pair them up with other children who can do that, or you're going to have to go around and work with groups on it. So it's not making it too difficult for yourself and doing a lot of planning in advance. Think in advance for what's going to happen, but you don't necessarily have to produce lots of individual resources. And I think that then sort of lowers the workload to some extent.
I think the crucial thing is that the most important concept in education improvement is opportunity cost. So every hour that a teacher spends producing 3 different lessons for the same group is an hour they don't spend on anything else. So we need to think about, is the extra time that teacher is spending producing improvements in learning, and is there another use of that time that could have been even more productive for the students? And I think as long as we think about that opportunity cost, what else could the teacher have done with the time they spend planning differentiated lessons, for example, then I think we'll make smart decisions. But everything has a cost. The teachers don't have any more hours in the day. The question is there a better use of this time that would lead to more student learning?
Lovely. Thank you both very much. And thank you everybody for those questions. I hope that supports your supports your thinking and your practice. Moving on now, I've grouped some questions here from Tina, Guillermo and Shalini. So Dylan, I'm going to ask this one to you first. How connected is differentiation with the ability to modify the pace of one's class sessions in terms of covering the curriculum? So this is about curriculum coverage and how adaptable we can be with that. Shalini talks about that they have fixed systems fixed, assessment points for their students. So how can they manage that to give access to all in terms of the difficulties of the questions that they're using to assess their curriculum?
I think the first thing to note is that at the outset, the curricula, particularly for science and mathematics subjects, are too full. There's just way more stuff than can be covered reasonably. My hunch is the reason for this is that people who develop curricula cannot bear the thought that the fastest learners have any spare time on their hands. So the curricula are designed for the fastest learners. And if you've got a true mixed ability group, the horrendous thing is that there's some kids in that group who are learning stuff about 5 times the speed of the slowest learners. And so the question is, what do you do with that? Now, what you could do is just teach the curriculum at a level that satisfies the fastest learners, and you leave the other students behind. That's a logically coherent, but in my view, immoral position. Another approach is what happens typically in the United States, which is that you water the curriculum down and you cover the whole curriculum, but at such a shallow level, you get this curriculum that Bill Schmidt described as a mile wide and an inch deep. The third, and in my view, the only sensible alternative, is to say, we can't teach all of this to all the students, and therefore we're going to teach less than the whole curriculum to make sure that more of the students are brought along. Now, if you're in a situation where you are held accountable for covering this entire syllabus, one of the things you can do is delegate the less important parts to homework or self-study units. You have to draw a line somewhere, and you can't cover all the syllabus with all the students. And so you have to make a decision about, is this of lasting importance? Is this something that goes somewhere? Is future learning dependent on students understanding these concepts? And then also, could it be delayed for a year or two? Sometimes we can make those kinds of decisions. Right? So say, does it have to be now that students get this concept? But I think those decisions are made by teachers in real time all the time. And I think the important thing is surfacing them so that those trade-offs are explicit rather than just being the result of unintended decisions. But ultimately, I think we have to say there's too much here, and to cover it with any depth, we have to leave some of it out. And let's make smart choices about what we leave out or what we deprioritize so that we actually spend more time on the things that are really crucial for future success in this subject.
Thank you, Dylan. Chris, anything to add to that about curriculum coverage?
Okay, I think Dylan covered that pretty comprehensively. I mean, I think he's right in that you do have to make compromises sometimes between whether you actually want to support certain students or whether it is that for that part you're going to just let that bit go and pick it up later. I mean, certainly parking areas to pick up later and noting that is something that many of our teachers do, so that in the end there is a sort of summary and coverage and summative assessment, but the formative assessment takes the foreground, and that's what's really supporting the students to help them keep going.
Thank you, Chris. That's lovely. Moving on, next question. I'm going to ask directly to you, Dylan, first. So this is a question about teaching approaches, an interesting question, because one of the things we've looked at on the online course is this idea about scaffolding. So Eleanor's just asking a question, can we consider scaffolding a lesson and differentiating instruction, which I know is what they call it in different areas of the world, as two different things?
I think for me, scaffolding is one approach to differentiation. So there are two common models to differentiation. One is what I call the marks for style model. The idea is we give all the students the same task. It could be an investigation in science or an exploration. And what we do is we differentiate according to how well the students do the task, but all the students get the same task. The second model, very much more commonly used in mathematics, is what I call the degree of difficulty model. The idea is that we differentiate by giving some students more challenging tasks than others. So in the marks for style model, all the students get the same task. Differentiation comes from how well they do it. In the degree of difficulty model, students in the same group get given different tasks, some of which are more difficult than others. I think there's a third model developed by Alistair Pollitt and Aisha Ahmed at Cambridge. And they call it the support model. So rather than giving some students tasks that they can't do, or students given sort of watered down tasks which use a shallow response, the differentiation comes through how much support does a student need to complete this activity? And that's where I think scaffolding comes in. Now, obviously, the thing to watch for scaffolding is that you take the scaffolding away to allow the student to do the work without the scaffold. And the work of John Sweller suggests that, for example, when you want to teach problem solving in mathematics, worked examples, where you take the student through the worked example and then give them a similar problem and miss out the final step, and then give them some more similar examples again, but miss out the final 2 steps, so that whenever you give students scaffolding, you have a plan for removing the scaffolding. I think that's the crucial thing, because otherwise there won't be any learning. So basically, yes, by all means scaffold, but then remove the scaffolding systematically. And the work of John Sweller suggests it's better to move the scaffolding from the end of the task than from the beginning. It seems to be more successful to leave out the last step rather than the first step, and then progressively to withdraw the guidance from the end of the process, so the students are having to complete them themselves. And that seems to be pretty well supported by the research that we've got so far, although the research evidence is pretty thin.
Thank you, that's really helpful, Dylan. It reflects some teaching I was doing yesterday where my students couldn't get started, but by getting them started with modelling, they then were able to do it, that taking away the last step rather than the first. Really interesting. Chris, anything that you'd like to add about scaffolding as part of differentiation?
So I think the most important thing is for teachers to understand what scaffolding is, and that is to provide the sorts of thinking for children, or the prompts of thinking that will allow them to reconsider what the work is and to have another go at things. What many teachers do in classrooms is to actually just provide hints or provide answers to things, and they think that the scaffolding is doing that, taking them step by step through, rather than providing the means by which students are allowed to actually do the thinking for themselves. So it's, as you were saying earlier, deciding which bits need scaffolding and which bits don't, and not just assuming that children will need everything.
And can I just add one more point there? I think the really important point for scaffolding, like for feedback, the purpose of scaffolding is to improve the student, not the work. And as Chris says, some teachers just give the scaffolding that enables the student to complete the task, but because the student doesn't have to do any of the intellectual heavy lifting, nothing gets learned. So the important point is, what's your withdrawal strategy for the scaffolding? Is the student being improved by this process, or are you just producing a nice, neat, final, correct piece of work where the students have done little of the thinking, the teacher just told them what to write?
Okay, moving on. Our next 3 questions I'm grouping. So this is from Cornelia, Guillermo, and Emma. And because one of the things that we looked at in terms of supporting and scaffolding for our students on the online course was the use of thinking organisers. So we're looking here at ideas for how we can tell that thinking organisers are actually supporting the students, and particularly in terms of more abstract ideas. So Chris, I'm going to ask you if you could answer this one for us first. Any resources in particular for students in secondary settings where there's more abstract ideas, and how we can use thinking organisers to scaffold that learning?
Okay, so I think that the use of organisers, what's important is to keep them simple, because what they're trying to do is support the work that's going on, support the thinking. And so getting students used to using organisers when they're actually working in mixed groups is quite useful, because students can actually learn and model off other students. But also the teacher making sure when they're actually going around checking on students doing work, that the organiser is actually doing the job that it's meant to do. Sometimes students get distracted by filling in the organiser rather than thinking of the organiser as something that's actually helping structure their work. So it's important before you start using organisers to really key your students in by some simple practice to actually get them working well. And then when it comes to preparing things, teachers need to think about the students' work that's done before in this area, and then to build the next organiser based on the one that they've used previously.
I think the thing to remember about organisers is that we've always used them. 50 years ago, we were telling children to organise their scientific experiments by what the experiment was designed to show, what the procedure was, what the results were, what the conclusion was. So anything that says, method, results, conclusion, that's an organiser. The question is, does the organiser as Chris said, help the student organize their work? And does it also lead to a student internalizing the organizer so that the organizer becomes progressively less necessary because the students internalize those ways of thinking about the discipline? It means that they occur to them naturally. So, anything that helps organize our thoughts, you could actually even regard the long multiplication algorithm as an organizer. It's a way of making our brains more powerful by distributing some of the thinking into marks we make on pieces of paper. So the idea is, this is what David Perkins and other psychologists have called person plus. The idea is that by making marks on pieces of paper, we can amplify the power of our brains. And so the question is this productive? Is it sustainable? Is it long-term? And you're focusing on that rather than on which particular graphic organizer or organizer we use, I think is very powerful. One final note, there is some research from concept mapping. I don't know if it's been replicated recently. It's quite old research now. But in science, it was found that when students do concept maps, the learning was more powerful if the students were given the nodes of the concept map and asked to create the connections between the nodes than being given the connections and asked to produce the nodes. So I think that's probably because they didn't have enough ideas about this domain to work out what the nodes were. So I think, again, careful structuring of the organizer has a big impact on the actual learning that takes place.
Thank you, Dylan. That's great. Moving on now to our next question from Nike. This question, Nike has been looking at using collaborative learning experiences in their classroom. Learning's more fun and interactive. However, they've been criticised because individual learning is becoming less clear. So they had a question, apart from exit tickets that they have used, are there any suggestions that we've got that they can look at how to assess individual performance when they're asking pupils to work together on highly mental tasks, particularly related to numeracy and literacy? So Dylan, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that when you're doing collaborative or cooperative learning, there are two clear principles that need to be enacted for the research, for the work to be successful. And that is, you have group goals, so the students are working as a group, not just in a group, and you have individual accountability. And that means that each student is responsible individually for putting forth their best learning efforts to help the group succeed. And so one of the things you can do is, if you must document individual contributions, is at the end of the group activity, is for each student to document what they thought their personal contributions were to that group activity and how they might do it better in the future. So this is clear from the work of the Johnson brothers, who talked about not just enacting these principles, but thinking about how can we make ourselves more effective as cooperative learners. And so a period of reflection, ideally, if the students have those literacy skills, written reflection, can do two things. It'll provide the students a chance to reflect and improve their own practice, but it'll also produce clear evidence for the teacher about what it was that those students did in that group setting. And I think that might satisfy the accountability requirements that this questioner is referring to.
The next question we're going to look at, Dylan, is 21 on our list, and it comes from Sarah. Sarah's asked, can one categorize a class or a group by various learning styles and then set up activities to match these? Or do you think that's a too structured approach to looking at how we differentiate for learning?
Well, I don't think it's too structured an approach, but there's no evidence that it's a successful approach. So psychologists disagree about whether learning styles exist. Some psychologists have said there's no such thing as learning styles. People aren't really visual or auditory or kinesthetic learners. I'm agnostic about that. I don't know whether these learning styles exist, and maybe a different way of thinking about learning styles might produce different results. But what I am clear about is that there is no evidence right now that trying to customize your teaching to mesh with a student's preferred learning style has any benefit for that student. So I would say, just first of all, be sensitive to your own teaching style. Be aware that if you think you're a visual learner, you may actually use teaching approaches that focus exclusively on visual approaches. So you need to be aware of the research on learning styles to know that you don't fall into the trap of of teaching in the way that you think you prefer to learn, be aware of the power of visual and auditory and kinesthetic experiences. But there is certainly no benefit in trying to customize your teaching to measure with students' preferred learning styles, and you'll drive yourselves crazy in the effort. So just my advice is just don't do it.
Thank you, Dylan. That was a very clear answer. That's the word that I'm looking for. Very clear response. So, Dylan, we've got a question from Aditya, who's asking that she works in a particular situation where pupils are very enthusiastic and engagement is high, but she's no way of knowing or being able to measure the learning that's taken place or the outcomes that are met. Have you got suggestions that could help?
I think the starting point is to realize that, as John Mason said many years ago, teaching takes place in time, but learning takes place over time. So I would say there's no such thing as learning in a lesson. And yet in England, we have school inspectors who expect to see progress within a lesson. Well, there's no such thing, because actually learning is this mysterious process by which our experiences are translated into long-term memories. So if you teach students they can do something today at the end of the lesson and they can do it tomorrow, but they can't do it in 2 weeks' time, I think you've taught them nothing. I don't think they've learned it. So I think one of the things we have to get into the habit of doing is to routinely assess students on stuff that they were taught days, weeks, and maybe even months ago. So some teachers I know, they test their students every Friday because practice of testing improves long-term memory. But in every Friday practice test, they include something from last week and something from last month. Now, first of all, that provides retrieval practice, which improves long-term memory, but also sends the message to the students that everything I've taught you is important. You can't just learn stuff and then forget it. If I've taught it to you, I've taught it to you because I think it's important, and therefore everything that you've ever been taught is important at some level for you to be able to retain. I think we need to get away from this idea that we can measure learning in a lesson. The process by which experiences get translated into long-term memories is very poorly understood. There are some people working on that right now, but the clear advice is don't assume that because you've taught it, they learned it. Even if they could do it at the end of the lesson, they might not be able to do it 6 weeks later.
Thank you, Dylan. That's really helpful. Moving on then to our final section. So we've got questions here that are related to recommendations, because obviously it's very fortunate for us that we can tap into the expertise and experience that you and Chris have got. Do you have any recommendations, Dylan, for Mary Charles, who's looking at how she can engage students with STEM projects?
I think the first point is going back to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this has been criticized as a concept, but I buy into the idea that if children are worried about their parents getting divorced or their friendships or even hunger or where they're going to sleep that night, then the learning of school subjects is going to have very little relevance. And I think there's not much we can do like that. And the best we can do, I think, is to create school as a kind of safe space where they can get engaged in activities and forget all about that stuff. So sometimes, school works well when it doesn't take too many things into account in saying, well, because you're having a hard time, we're going to make this less demanding. Sometimes you might actually make it more demanding and allow the student to get really engrossed in an activity, and therefore they forget their other cares. So I think it's just that being sensitive to that balance of challenge and capability, and realizing that your priorities may not be the child's priorities at that moment in time. The question is, how can you actually get through to them and communicate effectively?
People often think science and maths is hard, and sometimes, you get, particularly with mathematics and to a little bit with science, that, they're told when they say to their parents or to people they know, they're finding science hard, and then the adult or whoever they're talking to says, yeah, I found it hard as well. Some children will think, well, therefore it's not possible for me. So I think what's really important is that you show children that they can succeed within both maths and science from early on when you're actually working with them. So you might be differentiating and giving them different things to do, but it's actually giving them things not that are easy, but that they have to work hard at and they can actually get there. And then making a bit of a fuss about, oh, you've done really well to do this. Or giving them something at the beginning of a lesson and say, right, you might not be able to do this fully yet, but by the end of next week when we've worked on this, let's come back and look at it again. and then remembering to come back and do that. So it's actually really sort of demonstrating to the children that they can do it, and then noting they've got to realise that you value it. And I often see it in primary schools. We've got a project at the moment called Ninja Science that we're doing at King's College in Cleeps, where we're trying to encourage children to do quite a few science skills within practical work in the primary classroom. And when they can do things like good recording, or they can do things like good measurement, like how do you measure the height of something, what instrument would you use to do that? You've got to select from them. Then they actually get rewarded with a ninja badge, which says either observing, recording, measuring, and I can't remember what the other one is, but there's 4 of them. And they're really pleased by that. Not only do they wear the badge, they have to write in their books that they've actually got a ninja badge. They have to write why they've been given it, because they have to recognise why they've got the badge. It's not just getting the badge, it's knowing why you've got it. And of course, they wear the badge home. Sometimes the parents wash it in the washing machine. There's all those sorts of problems that parents sometimes have. But the parents ask the children why they've got the badge. And so, again, it gets recognised at home and gets talked about. And it's working really well. It's actually, the children love getting their ninja badges. It's really interesting, this project, because the teachers at first were giving out the badges willy-nilly to almost anybody who just got there. And then after a while, both the kids and the teachers realised, right, I'm not going to give another badge until they've actually shown they can actually measure better, either using different instruments or whatever, or they can record better. So, can they now actually draw their table as well as put the data in the right place, rather than just to fill in the data in a table. So it's been quite interesting how they've sort of negotiated between them, the children and the teachers, what progression is within recording, within observing, within measuring. Yeah, it's quite interesting how you can do that. But it's going back to what I said early on. If people think science is hard, show them that they can do it, and show them that you've recognised that they can do it, and use that word yet. All right, if they say, I can't draw graphs, you say, you can't draw graphs yet, but let's work on it. I've got some tools that's going to help you. And then coming back saying, so how are you doing? Are these tools helping? And then eventually they can probably do it without those tools supporting them, because those tools are the scaffolding to actually get there. So it's this idea of differentiating being scaffolding and then gradually removing the scaffolding. So yeah, it is possible.
The next question from Monica is, she's found the course useful, has learnt from it. Are there any books that you could recommend to help for her and others who are wanting to develop their differentiation practice?
Well, Monica mentions in her question the idea of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And I think it's important to realize that in Vygotsky's psychology, development was different from learning. So although people don't realize this, Vygotsky believed in stages of psychological development just as much as Piaget did, but Vygotsky didn't give them labels, so that doesn't come through very strongly when people read his work. But he believed that thinking, as we progress into adulthood, moved up a series of developmental levels, much in the same way as Piaget, moving from concrete operational to formal operational. And Vygotsky saw the purpose of education as accelerating that development. So he said that the only good teaching is that which is an advance of development. So he saw the point of school as speeding up what he called these maturing psychological processes. Unfortunately, there seems to be very little evidence that these levels of thinking actually exist. Whether a student is at the right developmental level doesn't seem to be a very useful thing to think about in terms of planning teaching. What really matters is that students have the prerequisite knowledge. So if you want to teach addition of fractions, the really important thing is that that child can develop sequences of equivalent fractions. And if they have the prerequisite knowledge, there is no evidence that things are developmentally inappropriate in Vygotsky's terms. So I think the really important thing is, let's focus on making sure that as much of our time is spent teaching our students things they don't already know. So we might talk about the zone of proximal learning rather than the zone of proximal development, because learning and development aren't really usefully distinguished. And therefore, formative assessment helps us find out where students are, and then our expertise as teachers helps us figure out what are the next steps for this individual student? Obviously, that will be very complex in a group of 30 or 35. The important point is, without that evidence of where the students are, it's highly unlikely your next instructional steps will be effective. Doesn't guarantee that they will be, but they're just stacking the odds in your favor when you find out where your students are starting from. There's more chance that what you do is going to be useful.
Teachers are sometimes after that there's a textbook where everything is differentiated, but of course differentiation's got to be tailored to your class, so you're not going to find that. What you can find is looking through a range of resources and looking at different ways that people have done things and thinking about how that might be used. So, for example, I was working with my pre-service teachers only yesterday, and we're doing the topic of osmosis. We look at a whole lot of different practicals, demonstrations, and class practicals. And what we decided to do, because they knew they were going to have to make a choice when it came to deciding which ones were going to go into a unit of work. And it was actually looking at, so what learning can take place within these activities? Which ones actually lend themselves well to data collection? Which ones lend themselves well to sort of seeing the phenomena of osmosis, seeing either potatoes swell up or seeing apricots swell up when you put them in water, dried apricots. Which ones demonstrate that? Which ones are really good in terms of if I actually want to move them on and think about critiquing different methods of doing things and what is one method, why is one method better than another? What are the ones that really are good at showing that they've got the practical skills to move on and take that data and put it into a graph? And so which are the ones that collect the sorts of data you can actually put into a graph? So we were actually working this out, and then we were deciding, so which ones would we choose? If we've got a 2-week or a 3-week topic coming up, we've got all these ones to choose from, which would we choose in terms of what they can offer, the opportunities? And then thinking about the classes that you actually have. So I made them think back to the classes that they've just been teaching recently and say, think about your year 10 class, that's your 15-year-olds. Think how your 15-year-olds might respond to this. Would some have problems with this particular activity? Right, what could you do to this activity so they can access in if there is going to be difficulty? All right, so, and then what if somebody gets it done, gets some data quickly? How can you move them on? So it's just those small decisions that go into your planning. You're planning for what activities you're going to do, and then you're actually looking at your class and your activities and thinking about how you might put them on. So I would go for any resource that's got a variation of different things to look at, and then look carefully at them and think about how might I use these within the actual planning for my differentiation.
There's a lot of stuff on learning progressions in science and mathematics in particular, but I'm currently not convinced that they're useful. I think teachers should know about this stuff, because I think it is useful to think about when somebody's understanding of light gets better, what is it that gets better? And some of the old versions of the English national curriculum have some quite nice models of progression in science. But the thing to remember is that in almost all subjects, the order in which students learn stuff is determined by the order in which they are taught stuff. And so different sequences of teaching will result in developmental progressions. So I think there are a few developmental progressions that we can say are inevitable. I think children will understand addition before they understand multiplication. But beyond that, it's not at all clear that division is harder than multiplication. It's harder computationally, but it seems that conceptually, understanding the concept of division is easier sharing than the concept of multiplication. So I think teachers may well choose to teach things in different sequences from other teachers, and that's okay. That's part of teachers' creativity. That's part of teachers' inquiry into their own practice. And that might mean that the progressions you get from other people aren't that useful. So I think teachers should be encouraged to think about progression. Once you know what they've learned, what do you do next? And if you think about that kind of process, what's the next step for this learner? So one concrete activity I can suggest for teachers is just to take some work, some student work, say maybe 6 examples for 6 different students, and sit down with another teacher and say, what is the next step for this child? So normally when we mark students' work, we give that 30 seconds. And to take that 30 seconds and slow it down and say, maybe let's take 10 or 15 minutes and think about, from this work, what can we learn about that child's capabilities, and what would we suggest as the next steps for that child in their learning? And just giving a chance to talk that over with teachers, with other teachers, I think would be as valuable as any books that I could recommend, because this stuff is not yet very well understood.
Lovely, that's brilliant, Dylan. I think you've already started answering the next question from Guillermo, which was looking at what are the best ways or tips to encourage teachers or colleagues to start teaching using differentiation for learning. And I think your idea there about looking at different students is one that already adds to that. Is there anything else that you've thought about that you could add to our thinking for this one?
I think there's a prior step, which is before you try to persuade anybody about the benefits of differentiation, you should seek to find out why they're not convinced about this already. So some teachers say, I don't need to differentiate because my teaching works for my students. Or what often happens is that the students who are not successful in that subject give that subject up. And so the teacher is only faced with students who are engaged and motivated. So I think you have to understand why it is that somebody doesn't think differentiation is important, and then work from there. So yes, working collaboratively could be helpful. But the other thing is people will say, well, I haven't got time to do this. And whenever people say, I haven't got time to do this, I always say, yes, you have, but you're currently spending it on something else. The question is it more valuable? And so I think starting out from those assumptions about why differentiation is or is not important may be more helpful than actual concrete solutions. I'm reminded of Karl Popper, who once described school as a series of unwanted answers to unasked questions. And so the danger is if we're trying to bring other teachers on board, we may be actually giving them solutions to problems that they don't think they have. So start from where they are. Like good teaching of students, start from where your colleagues are rather than where you'd like them to be.
I think it's actually getting teachers to work together so that they try something out. They think, right, what might I do to differentiate the work I'm doing with this class for these children and for this topic? Maybe get two working on the same topic and sharing what they're doing, talking about it, and then sharing that with others. Because even if it's a different topic in a different class, you might get ideas that you could then adapt for your class. So it's this idea of professional sharing and professional learning through looking at what others do. What's always hard is a blank sheet and thinking, right, what can I do? But if there's ideas there from others, then I think that's probably one of the best ways moving forward, which fits, quite well with the work that Dylan's done on professional learning communities. So setting up, but not necessarily a huge professional learning community where you're reporting to everybody, but small ones where you can actually work in groups and then share after that.
I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add before I summarise my thinking.
I think the crucial thing for me, as I mentioned earlier, is this thing about opportunity cost. So for me, differentiation is not necessarily a good thing. Think about how much time it's taking you to do this differentiation. And then also being clear about differentiation about what. And as I said earlier, I'm not convinced that differentiation is that valuable a goal. So in my early academic work, in fact, the very first academic paper I ever had published was about value added measures. And I used to think that value added was really important. And it is for holding schools accountable. But as teachers, I think value added is quite a dangerous concept because we can think we've done enough for that child if we've helped that child make a lot of progress, but they're not yet at a level where they can have a purposeful, fulfilled and flourishing life. So I actually think now I'm more worried about status. And if we need to put more effort into making sure that the lowest achievers reach a reasonable level of achievement, then we should do that. And so for me, I think differentiation can too often become an excuse for accepting low achievement from students. And I think that's unfortunate, and it's storing up problems for the future. So for me, it's about what is the level that we want every single student to achieve so they can make valuable and purposeful contributions to society. And then designing our education system so we get every single student there. And so the differentiation might be just in terms of effort. If some students need 3 times as much support to reach a certain level of achievement, then we'll make sure they get it. Because the students higher up the level, higher up the achievement levels, will probably be okay because they can actually figure things out for themselves. So I think that's something I've changed my mind about quite a lot over the last 10 years. I'm now much more worried about the low achievers and making sure they get to a level where they can participate effectively in society. And I'm worried about stretching every single kid. It's a trade-off, and different people may have different values, but my views have certainly changed on this.
Thank you, Dylan. That's a lovely point to finish on, and I think it's really good for people to hear as well that people we look up to in terms of education and expertise, your ideas develop as well over time, because we're all learners. I think that's really powerful for us to hear you saying that. So just in summary, I'd like to thank you, Dylan, and Chris, who I think made a sterling effort to try and join us. I do like to always think about the key themes, and again, this is just through my filter, isn't it? So people are going to listen to this question and answer session and might have different things that come out. But for me, as always, there's been a rich list of research that you've referenced, and I think that's really powerful. There's been lots of teaching approaches, how we can use them more effectively, getting our pupils to give 3 different ways of explaining, providing the nodes for concept mapping. So ideas, just simple tweaks for us. In terms of teaching approaches in our classrooms where we're trying to get all children learning, this effective use of pupils has come out really strongly, I think, from what you and Chris have been talking about today. This idea about group goals, individual accountability, this purposeful grouping and regrouping of students, and tapping into ideas over time, this idea about learning and scaffolding. But I think what's come out strongly for me, and I think this is really powerful, I think, for people to go away, is this idea about this professional judgment. It came across, I think, from the answers from both of you in different ways, whether it was thinking about being strategic, about making decisions about what to park or what are less important in terms of the curriculum, or whether it was thinking about how we support all and whether or not we do or we don't, that compromise is inevitable. It's this idea that we are professionals in our, in where we are in our classrooms, and that actually we need to talk to each other, our peers, to actually have this dialogue about what are the valuable things that we are teaching for our students. And I think that's really powerful for me. As always, and it echoes the principles of our course, all that we talk about is driven by the evidence that we gather in terms of where students are at. And I really liked the way that we tied it in, that you tied it in at the end, Dylan, then as well, about the evidence about where our colleagues are at in terms of their thinking. It's this formative practice that drives forward learning. And then just to sum it up, I think the final thing that came out really strongly for me, and I think you've just echoed it in your final summary, is this idea about, if you are going to do differentiation, it's this inclusive differentiation, that we are thinking about the future goals for our learners. So thank you as always. Rich information, things to go away and digest. As I said, people on the course, I know our learners, participants, thank you for your questions. There will be comments that underpin this on the course, but I know that these Q&As also go on YouTube so that people can bookmark them and come back to them later. As I said, thanks to Dylan and Chris, thanks to the National STEM Learning Centre, because these are always such fantastic opportunities. And thank you to Matt Cornock, who sits in the background, who has done a sterling effort today recording this and capturing it, but is also, I know, going to put a lot of effort in editing it as well. So thank you very much, and thank you to all our learners, and we look forward to seeing you again online in the future.